Hi, I'm Lois from Monthly Meeting of Friends, Philadelphia. This is Adult Education, introducing Joan Broadfield from Chester County Meeting.
No, Chester Friends Meeting.
Sorry, Chester Friends Meeting. She first met Anthony Benezet in a book, she's forgotten the name, in 1969. And she went around asking how could friends have possibly owned slaves? This just can't be true. And that started her whole research into what was going on with Anthony Benezet and the history of Quakers and the problem of slavery. So this is Joan.
Thanks, Lois, and thanks for the invitation to speak. And actually, what this really is about is based on a book. I've read through parts of another book written in the 30s by about Anthony Benezet, which mostly talks about his role as an educator in general, in Quaker schools and in girls' schools in particular. But what makes this so interesting is it was written by an African-American named Maurice Jackson. It's a more recent book, and it really does focus on his work as an abolitionist. And Maurice Jackson may be exaggerating, but he's got a lot of evidence to show that he might not be exaggerating about the importance of his work in abolition worldwide, not just in Philadelphia. So I have a slideshow that I've created, and I would like to use it as a prompt for me to be able to share what I am still learning about Anthony Benezet, if that's okay with you. I will go in and hopefully find, there it is, my slideshow. Go to from the beginning. Go away, you. Let me see. From the beginning, there we go. So Anthony Benezet, Quaker teacher and international abolitionist. I'm wondering what you have heard about Anthony Benezet, and if you have the chat and you have something you know about Anthony Benezet, feel free to put it in the chat. Of course, I can't see the chat right now, so I'll catch up with you when I'm off of the slideshow, or if Lois can see the chat, she's welcome to say something, but we can also hold off on that. This picture that is on the cover of the book is apparently pretty well known. It's the picture you find on Google when you Google Anthony Benezet. The book that I read most recently is called Let This Voice Be Heard, and it's by Maurice Jackson. The subtitle is Anthony Benezet, Father of Atlantic Abolitionism. What I found most fascinating is learning that Anthony Benezet was born of Huguenot parents in France. The family left France due to persecution and settled in England, and then emigrated to the United States. Now, considering this background of difference and the effect of such an immigration from France to England under real persecution, apparently they literally left before being either jailed or killed, and it was that bad. So he's an outsider to British norms, very connected to his family, clearly with the memory of emigration, or at least the stories of that emigration. His work on abolition included connections to France and Africa with early abolitionists. I think it's fascinating to think about that and why his focus on abolition was as clear as it was internationally. He had the connection, he had language, and he spoke more than one language, apparently more than two languages. That I think is a really part of the passion he had also about believing that African American children were not subhuman, were equally able to learn. Maurice Jackson is African American, and here's some information about him, which I'm not going to read all of it. You might want to peruse it as I'm talking. Maurice Jackson is African American who had been looking for and suddenly finding this information. He was interested in Quakerism, but more interested in, oops, I have these in wrong order and I apologize. So from the introduction, he had read 3 Black men who wrote in 3 different centuries, and they all mentioned Benezet. I don't know if the first name is familiar to you, but an African who was captured and enslaved, but then was free afterwards and was a writer, 1789. And I can't pronounce his name, so I'm not going to try. But we do have his book in the Early Meeting Library if you're interested in reading it. W.E.B. Du Bois, who I'm sure you've heard of. Carter Woodson. Carter Woodson is a historian, African-American historian, who actually is the person who invented African-American History Month. We sometimes forget that it existed before Martin Luther King Day. And I'm not sure that we white folks maybe were as aware of it as maybe African Americans were. So going back, and I do apologize for having not gotten all my slides in order. So here we have a timeline. We have the timeline of Quakers settling into the United States between 1650 and 1780. And Anthony Benezet's years are 1713 to 1784. So he was a, what's the word? He lived at the same time as John Woolman, and also the wonderful man, I'm going to forget his name, Benjamin Lay. The 3 of them actually did consort together on the work that they all believed in doing, and all did very differently. I mean, think about it. Benjamin Lay was a character. If we think today of friends we know like Benjamin Lay, there was a wonderful friend in your meeting who had AIDS and was in ACT UP, one of the starters of ACT UP in the 80s. I remember him so well. He reminds me of that spirit of a Benjamin Lay in his very clear, not being afraid to stand up and do something dramatic. John Woolman, the person who was committed for friends to hear the need to give up enslavement, to farm without unpaid labor. In 1758, Quakers Minute, the Quakers leaving public office. These are just interesting dates to think about. 1776, the Declaration of Independence and the U.S. Revolutionary War and the Constitution. And the work in Britain to end slavery reaches its first benchmark in 1788 to 1833. And I did not realize that until I was reading this book. So Abolition, a condensed timeline. 1682, Penn granted Articles of the Free Society of Traders against lifetime slavery. In 1688, the Germantown Minute, which the first protests against enslavement practices by Friends in Philadelphia, did not make it to the yearly meeting. I don't know if you know the story of this, but Germantown Friends and Germantown Mennonites were working together on this. And in 1988, Billy Grassi, who was then a peace staff person at yearly meeting where I was working, was living in Germantown, and sparked an event to commemorate that time, which was quite exciting. It was just before Germantown Avenue was beginning to be reconstructed. So it kind of worked out really well as a kind of a rebirth of Germantown, which is kind of cool. In 1711 to 1715, Chester meeting. Now, this might be my meeting, but I also know, incidentally, Lois, we're in Delaware County, not Chester County, which always confuses people. Chester meeting was also what is now media meeting. And it was also a meeting that held preparative meetings. I'm still trying to learn more about all of this, but I know that Joan Soderland, who wrote a book about Quakers and slavery, talks about this as well, about the Chester meeting being very active in trying to get yearly meeting to stop enslavement of members. Their efforts do seem to have died down a bit, and we would love to learn more about that. We have someone in our meeting that has been working on that as well, but she's taking a vacation from that at this point. And in 1718, a person disowned for publicly disagreeing by Philadelphia Yearly Meeting for writing the epistle concerning Negroes. So it looks like maybe they were really beginning to get a little serious about it at Yearly Meeting. But we do know that while the John Woolman work to get a minute passed was long and hard, it was not easy to follow up with the accountability required by the Yearly Meeting of disowning members who owned slaves. And it would be nice if we had thought of other kinds of accountability measures, perhaps. 1727, London Yearly Meeting strongly condemns the slavery trade. 1737, Ben Franklin publishes Benjamin Lay's book, which, think about that. I mean, that's kind of cool, right? This very, very active friend who's working and startling Quakers with his very outward action. I don't know how much you know. He was a dwarf, apparently, and he would do things like carry a Bible with a pig's stomach with something red in it that looked like blood, and he would do this dramatic stabbing of himself, and the blood would go all over the place. So he was very, very trying everything he could to get friends to really pay attention to this. And Anthony Benezet was also doing a lot of stuff. One of the things that he did was formed a school for free Blacks, and was very, very convinced that they could learn as well as white people. 1755, Philadelphia Yearly Meeting finally ends allowing slavery within membership. And the manumission records show Benezet's visits had some connection to that, according to our author. 1775, there was a beginning of a committee called the Pennsylvania, which later became the Pennsylvania Abolition Society, which actually still has existed, at least when Margaret Bacon was alive in the 90s. And I assume they still do. I think they were connected at one point with Temple University, and I'm not quite sure if that, I should have done my homework, and I apologize. 1776, Philadelphia Yearly Meeting, Epistle to Visit Those Who Own Slaves, begins Benezet's major published writings. And Benezet wrote writings on notice on the slave trade, and on pamphlets and personal letters, some of them very interesting. They're quoted in this. There's another book, though, of his writings. They're not as sort of soul reaching as John Woolman's journal, but they're not a journal. I mean, they are letters to, and they are definitely entreating people in England to think carefully about what enslavement does to the white people who own them, not just to the African Americans who are enslaved. So that book is at the library. I did also look through that because I was actually trying to find something like a John Woolman statement and I couldn't find one, but it's very interesting to read through it. So other things from the introduction, he collaborated with John Woolman. They wrote the epistles of caution and advice concerning the buying and keeping of slaves. and Woolman's, sorry about the misspelling, Some Considerations on the Keeping of Negroes, he likely edited. Many English leaders really relied on Benezet's work, above all his writings about Africa, and they cited him as the father of the abolitionist movement. That was kind of startling to me. He challenged early leaders' view of Africa by offering empirical evidence that this was not a nation, not a continent of people who had no brilliance or no civilization, I guess you could say. To refute arguments about the innate inequality of Blacks, he read everything possible about African civilization, the command, and that helped with the command of languages he had that allowed him to study. So these are two of the books that he wrote. They are still available. I'm sure they're reprints. They're not, well, all the one on the left, I'm not so sure about. The Caution to Great Britain and Her Colonies, which was writing about the problems of slavery presented to those who were in power. And then some historical account of Guinea and of the slave trade, that writings to reflecting his travel and his learning about the slave trade, because he actually went to Africa and he connected with others to end it. I think his life for me is really lifts up the importance of education, not only for those who were Quaker, but his conviction that African heritage children were as educable as European heritage. He took advantage of what he had to simply offer education and was hired for a girls' school, as well as later on, I think Penn Charter he was part of as well. He believed in the experimental or the experiential part of life and of learning. And he was I believe it's true that he was really forced to have separate classes for the African heritage children. I think he would have preferred to have them together, but that wasn't about what would happen. So to me, he is a person with a clear testimony. And for the words of what testimony means to me, I love Harvey Gilman, a British friend who was staff person in the late 80s into the 90s on Outreach in Britain Yearly Meeting. And he wrote, "The word testimony is used by Quakers to describe a witness to the living truth within the human heart as it is acted out in everyday life. It is not a form of words, but a mode of life based on the realization that there is that of God in everybody, that all human beings are equal, and that all life is interconnected. It is affirmative, but may lead to action that runs counter to certain practices currently accepted in society at large. Hence, a pro-peace stance may become an anti-war stance." There are a couple of things I thought I would read from the book that might sort of fill out a little bit about his about him and maybe why he had the life that he led. I was reading something Mignon wrote about him, that he was a failed merchant. Yeah, I think that the family knew he was going to be a failed merchant from the beginning. When he was educated, now I'm going to look really hard for this. I was reading and I saw this sentence and I hope I find it. In a chapter called "An Anti-Slavery Intellect Develops." I love that idea, that from what he learned as a very young child, he was already beginning to really understand the issues of inequality. In 1727, Anthony Benezet's mother sent her 14-year-old out to pick up a 5-volume set of philosophical writings and correspondence. This errand perhaps led to Benezet's lifelong pattern of reading the work of leading thinkers and authors of religious, scientific, and philosophical tracts. As an adult, Benezet immersed himself in the works of the Scottish moral philosophers who had started a learned reasoning against slavery and the slave trade. Wow. I just love that. Do you remember what's the first book that you read? I just, think about how that influenced you as a life. My first book was a book called 31 Brothers and Sisters. It was my first chapter book. My father and mother were both very interested in Africa. My dad was an anthropologist. And 31 Brothers and Sisters had as its heroine this young girl in Africa, and the story of her getting water in the creek where she goes to get water. And on the way back, she discovers there's a rattlesnake. What does she do? She knows what to do. She doesn't call for help because she knows what to do. And I've sometimes wondered if having that early chapter book is one of the things that gives me a confidence I probably shouldn't have about a lot of things. So that's another reason to think about what are the books that you read or read when you were young and how they might have influenced you. I'm a great book person, as Susanna will tell you. I'm not sure it's a great book person, but I'm a very big book person. So yeah.
Really, yes, I will agree with that. Yeah. You actually lived in Nigeria for a while.
What?
You lived in Nigeria for a while. Did you not?
I can't hear you. Put it in the chat. Okay, and what was the other? There was another piece I was thinking of.
Yeah, I don't know. Where is it? Oh, here it is.
Benezet applied Quaker principles to his work with the enslaved Africans. Unlike most of his contemporaries, even those in the anti-slavery movement itself, he believed that all people were born equal in God's sight. He advocated a policy of nonviolence and disapproved of excessive material acquisitions and consumption. His observations led him to link Europeans, especially the British, with, quote, the love of wealth, unquote, that he believed was brought on by the burgeoning Atlantic slave trade. Benezet argued that wealth drove men and nations to war. He contrasted that constant desire for wealth in his own society with an image of African societies that he derived from his travel narratives and discussions with enslaved and free Africans. He believed that prior to the slave trade, Africans lived in relative peace and freedom with an abundance of necessities of life. Now, again, when we think of the necessities of life, we think of the things we have, right? But stripped down, and this was one of John Woolman's things too, wasn't it? Those things that are the reasons for war that we own. So they both shared that very much. And I see Susanna has given me a question I'm looking at, but first I need to get rid of that. Okay. Yeah, I lived in Nigeria for when I was very little. Oh, what did the girl do about the rattlesnake? Sorry. She froze. Absolutely still. Very still. Which is apparently what you're also supposed to do with a dog when it jumps at you. And I had that experience once, and I did freeze because there was not a whole lot I could do. So, yeah. So how unusual was it for Huguenots to become Quakers in Philadelphia? He became a Quaker in England. They went to England first. They became Quakers in England and then came over with the transition to the United States, to the colonies from England with other Quakers. I don't know of others, but I know there are some French folks who are Quakers that we know about. But I didn't see anything in the book about other Huguenots that were also Quakers. But if you know that Quakers in England were very much a part of welcoming people, welcoming immigrants, going to prisons, welcoming prisoners. It isn't a surprise that that family became Quaker from being a Huguenot. And are there other questions that I've forgotten? I don't think Benjamin Lay was French, but that's something you could probably look on Google for. We also have his book at the library, the Benjamin Lay book as well. So, and we have this at the library as well. So, and the reason I'm pushing the library is that we do get requests and we mail them to people, or they can pick them up from Friends Center during the week when it's open. Either one. You can email or phone to the library. You don't have to come in. Are there questions that you wonder about? Carol?
Was he a member of MMFP?
I don't recall. I think I've heard that he was, but I don't recall seeing that anywhere. So I will have to look that up and let you know. Do you know that, Tom, do you know that he was?
No, I don't. I researched and gave a talk on John Woolman, so I know how much they worked together. And they worked together in connection with the yearly meeting, but I don't know what Benezet was a member of. But I have a question. Roughly how old was Benezet when he came from England to Pennsylvania?
That's a good question as well. I believe he was in his early, oh shoot, I should not guess. I should know this. I think it was in the slideshow. Let me look really quick and see if I can figure that out. So if he was born in 1713, that's a really good question. And I should have, he was definitely in this country in the 1750s. I feel foolish that I didn't think of that.
Well, the real nub of my question, of my wondering is, he was self-educated like John Woolman was?
I believe that he had some schooling. The Benezet family had initially decided to stay in France. They had substantial wealth and to practice Catholicism outwardly. And then they changed their mind. And I remember reading this earlier and I should have gone back to it and I don't remember why I didn't. So in England, we forsook our parents and relations and whatever was dearest to us in the world to follow Jesus Christ and to make war against the devil and his followers. This was the source of that union, charity, and brotherly love which reigned among us. That was someone that they were following in England.
Well, it's interesting. What I'm wondering is, like John Woolman, he was well read in the Enlightenment as well as in the Old Testament and in religious history. They both were, I guess. And I'm wondering to what extent others influenced Benezet in his learning process.
Yeah, well, of course, and that was a very different time of how people were educated as well, right? So yeah, it's so hard to make a comparison. But I've got the answer to your question.
Go ahead.
1731 is when they came to Philadelphia from England. They moved to Philadelphia, and his likely ties to the London Quakers, and with its deep personal empathy toward the sufferings of the persecuted based on their own experience in France, was drawn to the Philadelphia Quakers. Given the principles of the Quakers, it is not difficult to see why a man like Jean Etienne Benezet and his family would join them. We know that young Anthony had grown to detest religious ritual as displayed by the spirit possession of the French prophets, or in the later demonstrative worship of the George Whitfield's Great Awakening. Yet he may have seen in both Quakers and the French prophets, quote, God's direct intervention in the lives of the oppressed.
Yeah.
See, that time, Fran, I mean, people were just hacking to bits Protestants. You know, I mean, this was the thing in France and in Germany.
Yeah.
So I see Susanna has asked a couple of, how unusual was it for Huguenots to come? I think we talked about, why were Quakers so late at protesting slavery? I haven't seen anything before the 1740s. Well, I think actually we saw that there were protests, but they didn't make a yearly meeting. Now, think about it. Think about how there is always a delay in how the yearly meeting acts because we are not a top-down group, right? In theory, it's the grassroots. So it's really because the grassroots weren't strong enough and determined enough to bring it forward. And that, that brings us to the Chester meeting story. We know that they were very involved for a while, and then they stopped being as involved. At the same time, the person who was looking at the Chester meeting history, there was an economic downturn. If there was an economic downturn, that might explain a lot about why suddenly it was a little harder to make the protest against slavery when there were other things in your life. In this pandemic, when we've had things in our lives, how have we been able to do things that we wanted to do because of the pandemic? And so it may be things like that prevented more. Yeah, Francis Pastorius apparently was a Quaker at one point. Now, he may have gone from Mennonite to Quaker, but then he went back to the Mennonites.
Yes.
We lost them after the minute didn't pass, apparently. The Mennonites went on and did it. I mean, this is what the Mennonites do great stuff, and I love them. I think if I weren't a Quaker, I'd probably be a Mennonite.
Right. Definitely. Yeah. Mennonites are fabulous people.
Well, and the women we know, that John Greenleaf Whittier was not only an abolitionist, but I would say he was a feminist. And he was a feminist, clearly, by the way he supported young women who were writing. And there's a really wonderful fiction book written by Elizabeth Gray Vining. I think it's in her Janet Gray name, which I think is one she used for children's books or teenage books, whatever. And she uses John Greenleaf Whittier in this particular book, The Taken Girl. We have it in the library. It's fun to read, about an orphan, basically, who is sort of fostered by this family in Philadelphia. And John Greenleaf Whittier is living in the same house, and it's kind of fun. Anyway, that's getting a little away from Anthony Benezet. Bowen, Tom, yes.
Did John Greenleaf Whittier promote Benezet the way he promoted the story of John Woolman?
I think he did not. He lived after his years or later. I have not come across anything from him about Anthony Benezet.
Well, again, what I came across was that John Greenleaf Whittier so promoted in his own time at the Civil War and before the Civil War, John Woolman, that John Woolman became more, his history became more widely known.
He wrote an introduction to the journal, yes.
Yeah, that's right. And I wonder if Benezet was a beneficiary, his history was a beneficiary of
My guess,
Whittier.
my guess is that that didn't happen, and I think that again goes to the writing. The
Yeah.
style of writing of John Woolman was much more of a poetic, soulful thing, whereas the writings of Benezet, who I'm sure Greenleaf would have loved, were not aimed at Quakers, were aimed at the world, were aimed at the rich people in England who Benezet thought if they could quit, slavery, maybe those in the US would then quit slavery. And it was up to his work that there's a particular correspondence he had with a woman in England who was apparently very influential. And when she got it, is about the time when England decided to stop enslavement. And that was basically the benefit of having Benezet do that work. Very, heartfelt letters, but not the kind of writing that John Woolman does in his journal, which is a different part of pace of writing.
Wow.
Yeah, Protestants were definitely not being treated well in France at the time the Benezets left. I think it's interesting too that they could have stayed perhaps and done what they could to kind of convert and all. And I think that says a lot about the depth of their own real conviction of faith. And I think that shows up again in Anthony Benezet and how he persisted with the work against slavery.
Did he have a family? Did he marry and have children?
He did, yes. And I think he had daughters. Don't think he had a son. I'm realizing all the things. See, I prepared this last year for Art Street, and I thought I was, sprucing it up a bit, and I added some more to the slideshow, and I should have thought of a little more carefully. So I will look that up and send that to Lois, who can share it. But yes, he was definitely married, and his wife was a partner supported his work, and it feels like they were a very sweet couple when I read the book. Yeah. As someone, I'm sorry. I thought someone said something. Maybe not. Anyway, as someone who really loves public education, I love that what Anthony Benezet really was about was public education, not just for Quakers, but for everyone. He really believed in education in a way that that it was really important for this new country that was growing up to have people who really could read and write and help the democracy form and flourish. So he was not a Quaker who stayed inside and helped his own people, which I'm glad there was John Woolman who was doing that. He did that, and he went out into the world. And he was probably an extrovert. My guess is that Woolman was an introvert. So that might have also been part of it. Yeah.
If he had children, there's probably some of this are around today.
I don't know. Yeah, well, I will look it up again and I will let you know. And I will add that to the things I need to put into a slideshow and presentation. So thank you.
I have another question.
Sure.
What has a meeting, the yearly meeting or one of the monthly meeting or some of the monthly meetings, what have they done to perpetuate Benezet's name?
I don't know. I don't know anyone that has. I honestly don't know anyone that has. That's one of the reasons I started talking to Margaret Bacon in the 90s. I forget where we were, probably at a yearly meeting function. And I think I heard her say the name Benezet, and I'm going like, oh my gosh. You know, I had read about this man very briefly. I wanted to know more, and I plied her with questions. And she said, oh, you'll be excited to know there's a young man who has asked me about him because he wants to write a book. And that turns out to be this guy, Maurice Jackson.
Yeah.
And apparently at one point he was at Penn, and he started working on it when he was at Penn, but now he's at Georgetown. And I was just very excited about it. And Margaret was too, because she didn't know a lot about him either, had heard stuff but didn't really have any more news than that. She thought she was going to start writing a book when this guy showed up, and she thought, well, I'll let him write the book. So that was good. For an African-American to find this man who was white and working so hard against slavery back then, I imagine it was when I read the introduction and I read his words, he must have been so excited, a little bit like I felt. My husband was African-American, my kids were African-American, and I'm sitting in this library reading about this man, like me, who's passionate about this. It was like, wow, you know, doesn't happen often. So it was really cool. So part of the reason I wanted to start on this journey of knowing Benezet better and having the information now that I can know him better, was to help friends in the yearly meeting know him and celebrate him. So Melinda Wenner Bradley is interested in talking to me about this, and we're going to have a conversation. Who knows, maybe there'll be a faith and play story about Anthony Benezet. That would be very cool. Do you guys know Faith and Play? Okay, it's a program for meetings that help children learn the stories both of Quakers and of the Bible through an acting out of the play on surface with little tiny people. That it's a very, very interesting program that was started by Episcopalians called Godly Play. And Melinda was so taken by it, she kind of helped friends create this Faith and Play version. And the idea is to help kids and adults recapture wonder in the stories that we have of the people of the Bible and of the people in our history. And I would imagine in any faith tradition that we would want to study. So, yeah. Oh, thank you, Susanna. They had 2 kids and they both died as babies. I forgot that. Oh my goodness. That may be one of the reasons he was so devoted to children.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
I imagine they both really, in Friends Journal. Thank you. Tell me email me the article. That would be great. I'd like to know who wrote it too. So hope this wasn't too disappointing with maybe not enough information.
Oh no,
But
it is.
I'm hoping I would love it if you were so interested that you would go and borrow books and read them, or buy books and read them, either one, about him, or go on Google and learn more about him. We all need to learn more. As a person who has done a lot of workshops in my day, I also know that the worst thing a person who does a workshop can do is give you all the information. You know why? You know why?
Because you won't do it yourself.
That's right. You'll never go and look yourself. So here's your assignment. Go find out.
Yeah.
You had good questions, and I'm glad I could answer some of them.
Well, thank you very much. This has been new stuff I hadn't heard before.
Well, there is a Benezet Street in Germantown, which I think is interesting that it's in Germantown. And so maybe that's a hint about where he was. But I thought he was connected with Fourth and Arch. And I thought there was some connection there, but maybe not. So more to learn.
Well, there is some connection because members of our meeting created a trust fund in his name to help poor Black students get clothing so they could go to school. And currently that trust fund is going to St. James, which is an amazing school for poor Black kids. They're all Title I. The school gives them clothing as well as an education, as well as their books. It even has food for their families. You have to be Title I to go there, but it does everything so those kids will get their education.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
that's really cool.
It's really good. Yeah, really good. So there we are. He's still alive.
Yes.
Which is great. Yeah. His love and his care is still with us. Yeah.
There's a, speaking of books again, if you look in your meeting library, you might have something by, oh gosh, I'm going to forget her name. Oh, crumb. She was a British friend who wrote so many children's books. Elfrida Vipont, and she also, Elfrida Vipont Folds. A Faith to Live By. Look for it in your library. I've seen it in my library so many times. I've never picked it up. I picked it up today and I looked in it. It's little biographies about friends over the decades, some you've never heard of before. And the last one is wonderful. And it made me think, this is a project we should be doing. I have an idea that I'm going to take to my meeting in my quarter about starting one. And who do we know, or, living or passed away, that we could say to them that we know there was a faith they lived by, and what's their story, and writing that out. We don't have enough of these. She was so good at that. She has a book about, I'm trying to remember the name of it. A friend of mine who is a pacifist who did not register for the military. And I asked him one day, he and I used to do workshops on selective service and being a CO. And he said, when I was about 14, I read this book. I don't remember the author's name. And then one day he said to me, oh, it was Charles Vipont. That was Elfrida Vipont Folds. She knew that if a guy was going to read the book, she would have to have a guy's name. And the book is about a young man who, can't go to war. And these books are wonderful of hers. We have them in the library, and we get more in, and I say we need to include them because they'll get worn out and they get thrown out. We still want one in the library. So, yeah.
You might want to get hold of Barry Krasno and Matilda Navias. They both seem really connected.
Well, I know them. What for?
Because they know all kinds of history they can recommend people to write about for your book.
Oh, but see, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying we need to go and look in our meetings and our quarters for the people around us that we would write about. The reason I say that is because of this last story in Faith to Live By. Read that story, and I think you'll get what I'm getting at. You may not know anyone like that, but maybe someone does. And, it's just like one story here and one story there. Yeah, and I might, Matilda, I would absolutely, that's a great idea. I should also give her a shout out about that idea, because she might really pick up on that. Yeah. She's a writer. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm a wannabe writer, but I haven't quite. I write letters to the editor.
You're a writer.
They've actually been published.
Okay. Definitely.
Yeah. Right. But they're short. So.
Well, it sounds like short chapters will do the job. So
there you go. Yeah. I write a lot for myself, but I haven't done a whole lot. But yeah, I will.
Italy, start now. No time like the present.
This is your leading, so you have to deal with it.
Now you are such an incredibly good storyteller. You know.
Oh, thank you.
Well,
I get that from my mom, right?
Well, she probably didn't write her book either.
Yes,
Right.
she did.
Oh, she
my
did.
mother, she did. She wrote a memoir. This is an amazing story. This is my mom. She wrote her memoir in 5 parts. Each of those parts was dedicated to a grandchild that she felt fit that particular part of her life. It was incredible. She grew up, she was born in Woodstock, New York, grew up in France. Her dad died there and they moved back to New York. And she went to Swarthmore College. She worked in DC with the OSS, precursor to the CIA, during World War II. And even though she'd become a Quaker kind of at Swarthmore, and they got married in England. They met in England. He also was working with the OSS. I know this is too long and boring for many of you, but
Not boring.
What's so fun about this is there's a picture of my dad that if you looked at it, and unfortunately it's not right here, he looks exactly like you would imagine French underground looked. You know, long hair, the beret, as skinny as a rail. He couldn't get into the Navy, which is where he wanted because he was underweight. So he went with the OSS and he did codes in France. He helped unscramble codes. So my mother was translating also in France for the OSS, you know. And when she told me the story back when I used to hear her tell the story as I was a kid, I would say, yeah, you wrote what's the word when it's like, oh shoot, what's the word? When you're writing for your own country, propaganda. You wrote propaganda. She said, no. It was like important information. Well, in the last 20 years of her life, she said, well, it was propaganda. So they got married in England. He was an anthropologist. And what Susanna was referring to, I was born in Texas, where my dad's from. And then we went to England, and then where he was working with the University of London's School of Economics, where he got his degree, and working with the English in terms of the decolonizing of Nigeria, with anthropologically focused. Then went back to England where my sister was born. Then we came here. No, my sister was born before we went to Africa, and then we came back to England, and then we came back here. So she's had an incredible life. I mean, you know, that's nothing to sneeze at. Yeah. So she wrote about it.
What was her name?
Virginia Boggs Gunn. Boggs, there's a connection there with Cokie Roberts, right, who's a Boggs also. Same family from Chicago, railroad people, apparently. You'd never know. I mean, we didn't have money. My dad was a professor at Lincoln University, where you like not very much money at all. But anyway, that's okay. We had the important stuff. So. Well, now you all have to tell me your lives.
We don't come close. Wow. A Boggs. Wow.
You're on mute, Lois. You're muted. Lois, you're muted.
Hi. Do you have any closing remarks, or should we end the recording?
I just hope that you are intrigued enough by Anthony Benezet that you will continue learning more about him, that we will together lift his name out of the grave and into people's hearts, because his spirit is certainly one of Quaker, actively working to free a people, not just the African Americans, but the white enslavers. And so he's an important person to think about and to learn about.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.